What is a project under CEQA? That is an important question. Why is it an important question? Well, the type of process for CEQA that you're going to have to go through as part of a land development project depends in part on whether or not your land development qualifies as a quote-unquote project under CEQA. So what is a project under CEQA? That has its own very specific legal definition, so it may not be what you or I think of as a project. You have to ask yourself, is this a project under the definition for CEQA? So how do you figure that out? So I'm going to try and help you do that in this video. So in order for what I call the full CEQA stack or the full CEQA process to apply to your land development, it requires three things. So three things have to be true. It has to require some kind of discretionary action by the governmental agency. Okay, it's not as hard as you think to meet that trigger. So basically, if you need any kind of discretionary permit or entitlement, then CEQA is going to apply. That's one thing. The second thing is it's got to reasonably impact the environment. Again, that bar is not very, very hard to get across. Most land development projects will have some impact on the environment. And the third requirement is it has to your land development has to be considered a project under CEQA. So that's one of the three things that has to be true if the full CEQA stack is potentially could apply. So you need to know if you've got a project under CEQA or not, because if you don't have a project, then you don't have to do the full CEQA stack, and that's a good news if you're a developer. The bad news is almost everything you try and do with commercial land development in California is probably going to be a project, and so I want to explain why that is. So let's talk about the legal definition of a project under CEQA. So there are three things that could make something a project under CEQA. The first is if it is a government action. So for example, building a new road, that's something that the government does. We don't build a lot of private roads here in California. If the government's going to build a new road, chances are that is going to be a project under the definition of CEQA. So major government action like that. Now you might think, well, that doesn't matter to me. I'm a private developer. I'm never going to build a road. That might not be true. You might be building roads as part of your project or funding the construction of roads as part of your project. So that line is not always as black and white as you think. The second thing that can make your land development a project under CEQA is if it receives government funding. So that could be a lease, a subsidy, a grant, a tax break. Again, it's not always black and white. There's some gray area there, but if you're dipping into the public purse to help fund your project, so for example, like an affordable housing project that gets some government subsidy, that could make your development a project under CEQA. And then the last thing is, and this is the one that catches most private projects, if your land development project requires some type of government approval and that approval is discretionary, in other words, some judgment is involved. And that's the one of the three triggers that catches most private land development projects in California, makes them subject to CEQA. So if you have a discretionary building permit, or you need a rezone, or you need a tentative subdivision map approved, most of those things are going to be considered discretionary actions, not what we call ministerial actions, and they are going to mean that you have a project, quote unquote, as far as CEQA is concerned. One other quick thing I will mention, and we'll talk about this in some more detail in some other videos, but you have to bundle related actions into the same project for CEQA when you consider environmental projects. So you can't do what they call piecemealing. So you can't break up your project into a bunch of little pieces and then say, well, none of these things are a project under CEQA, therefore we don't have a project. California courts don't like it when you do that. They want to look at the whole thing. So for example, you may not be able to separate your on-site improvements from your off-site improvements. So when you combine those two together, you may have a what they call a project under CEQA, and that may require you go through the full stack. So I don't want to get totally lost in the weeds here, but I'll just give you a quick example. Let's say you have a relatively simple project that your land development that you're doing on-site, but as part of the approvals or entitlements you need to get your permits, you have to do, let's say for whatever reason, you got to do some major off-site improvements. And those off-site improvements qualify as a project under CEQA, then you're on site. Even though it wouldn't without the offsite improvements, now your on-site project is also going to be have to be considered as part of CEQA. So just remember, you have to bundle. You can't piecemeal. And the other thing I would say is, it's not always crystal clear. Is this a project or not a project? I will add there are some statutory, what we call statutory exemptions. So even if you have a project, the full CEQA stack may not apply. I mean, it's not always clear, is this a project or not a project? I will give you a rule of thumb. If you're doing land development in California and you're not sure if you have a project under CEQA, you probably do. You probably do have a project under CEQA. Now, that doesn't mean you have to do the full CEQA stack, go through that whole process. You may not need an EIR, but you probably do have a project for CEQA. Almost certainly, if you're pulling any kind of permit and it's not a simple over-the-counter, check the 3 boxes, get your permit kind of permit, you probably have a project and you're going to have to deal with CEQA. And then, it's important to stop for a minute and think about the consequences of what I just said. And I wrote it down here because I wanted to make sure I said it properly. So what that means is every time you pull a discretionary permit for land development in California, you probably have a project under CEQA, and somebody on your team needs to have considered what are the consequences of that, right? And like I said, there's not lots, but there are several exemptions for CEQA. Even if you have a project, your project may be exempt. There are some other, you have some other wiggle room, but chances are if you're doing anything major with commercial real estate or land development in California, you probably have a project under CEQA, and you're going to have to deal with the CEQA process. So now you know what is a project under CEQA. The answer: almost everything related to land development is going to be a project under CEQA. That's why you have to have somebody on your project team that knows a little bit about CEQA and understands how CEQA is going to impact your land development project.